All right, I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument on a very non-standard night. This being neither a Monday episode nor a Thursday night debate breakdown. It's Wednesdays with Putin. I guess maybe this could be a regular feature. You know, every Wednesday we can find some Putin content. Most of it'll be in Russian, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, turn it into a real my afternoons with Maury type thing. Learn some life lessons, get to know ourselves, who we are. After all, it's not just about dominating Eastern Europe. KGB background helps enrich our very selves.
Yeah. So this is Deep State Kuba, who I did promise on Twitter that after last time I would have a talk with him about dialing back his Polishness for this one. So I don't know if I actually remember to
heard and rejected.
So we might still be at the same level of Polish that we were last time. But yeah, no. So on the actual episode on Monday, we managed to get through about the first third of this, the vast majority of which was spent before 2022 or 2014 or 1991 or 1917. But
the 16th century, our century.
Yes. I'm hoping that tonight, that would all have been wasted. I'm hoping what we watch tonight, President Putin will start connecting some dots and, sort of really, really drawing out exactly why all that stuff about who was sending who letters in the court of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania shows that it's actually perfectly fine to cluster bomb cities in Ukraine. But I suppose we'll have to see.
Actually, I have a theory on that. Something that I came up with after the show last time. The claims that he's making about the extent of legitimately Russian territory and legitimately Russian subjects. Ukraine is not a country. This is just all different flavors of Russia, and therefore it's ours. Now, from a contemporary international law standpoint or a Marxist standpoint, right, that type of argument from history, digging through the Royal Archives, it doesn't hold much water. It's just a lengthy excursus into irrelevant details. But there is one major power that uses that exact framework to justify its territorial claims, and that's the People's Republic of China. Mm-hmm. The reason that Tibet is considered as claimed by the PRC is because of a deal made with a lama in the Yuan dynasty. The reason that Taiwan or the Marquesas, the various rocks and atolls in the South China Sea belong to the PRC, according to their claim, is that there was some imperial connection from the Ming dynasty or earlier. And I think that without stating it, by using this type of deep historical reasoning in terms of substantiating his claim, Putin is, in a way, indirectly legitimating the Chinese approach to their territorial claims and setting up an alternative mode of legitimation to international law or popular sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, that seems as plausible as anything. It's got, because one of the things that was sort of most confusing about that first third is the who is this for question. Because, as you say, liberals who care about international law, they're certainly not going to be moved by it. Obviously, anybody with a materialist view about history and politics isn't going to be moved by it. And really, as far as how any of this plays with the Western audience, I mean, at best, it's all going to seem irrelevant, right? I mean, even somebody like Tucker Carlson, who I don't think anybody would mistake for Putin's harshest critic, is sort of said in that little intro that it seemed like filibustering to him, like he didn't really get the point. And that's the best case scenario. Really, if anything, as far, anybody who's taking it more seriously than that in a Western audience, this really, like this really plays into the hands of like neocons who just think that the war should be kept going for as long as it takes to expel Russia from everything forever, and maybe even maybe even somehow magically bring about regime change in Moscow, because like, yeah, I mean, because if you if you think what I think, right, that like we should have de-escalation and work towards peace and all that stuff, man, it does nothing for that case when he's like dwelling in the 16th century to try to explain how all this came about, because that it makes him seem like an ultra nationalist lunatic, and that doesn't do anything for the case that there's like a peaceful way out of all of this. So I think the only way really to make sense of it, I mean, like I'm assuming he didn't just get bored and decide to do all this. He came with documents copied from the archives, like in advance. So I assume that it wasn't that. So it's it's got to be, there has to be some audience he's playing for, right? Even if it's clearly not a Western one. So it could be a domestic audience, although you think he talks to them all the time anyway. It could be, you suggested last time that some of this is just about rubbing, the noses of, Poles, for example, because the claims that he was making about Poland, that, sort of into, kind of tried to troll and trigger, that audience. But, it does.
I mentioned before that the difference between Polish-German and Polish-Russian relations, where the Russians understand the Polish national trauma, Polish national narratives, the particular combination of cultural and historical facts that add up to, Polish national honor, let's say, and is willing to play with those symbols, play with those narratives in order to either curry favor when he wants to do that, or provoke and trigger when he wants to do that. The Germans do not play in that space. And I think that part of what he was trying to do, and he likely succeeded admirably, was provoke the Poles into being, too Polish, like myself a couple of days ago, so that Germans and other post-national Europeans would in turn get triggered by the Polish nationalist reaction. And thus, you can drive a wedge in the NATO alliance and in the EU by inflaming one particular group and making them seem crazy to the others. But I think when it comes to using these types of historical justifications, part of multipolarity is producing alternative modes of justification that don't go through the international institutions of the post-war period, that don't go through Washington or Brussels or London. And this mode, where if you're a great power, if you're one of the multiple poles, then you have your own destiny, which allows you to claim all the lands that Catherine the Great once called dibs on. China uses that as its approach, and this lends significant credence to that on the international stage. Then again, no one's entertaining a Mongolian narrative that from Kiev to Hanoi, right? This is all our land, right? We're digging up a note of submission from the Sultan in Baghdad to the Great Khan. So Iraq, please. It's something strictly limited to the great powers, right? Like,
yeah. I mean,
mhm.
even the Ukrainians, right? I mean, because you could like, if you're gonna like enact like, if you're gonna project Russian nationalism back to before there's a concept of a Russian, that's like hell. I don't know. I mean, Kiev and Rus were based in Kiev. That's why isn't that all Ukrainian territory?
Yeah, precisely. And the truth is that unless you're looking at Western European countries that have had the nationalism beat out of them by World War II, then virtually every state in Europe, most of the countries of the world, have a greater version of themselves, right? Like a greater Syria, a greater Kurdistan, a greater Poland, a greater Serbia. And you've got the maps which we claim these territories because the inhabitants speak our language. We claim these territories because we won them in a bridge game against the Sultan, and we're claiming these territories because we've got a letter from the Pope, right? So we you don't have to take any of these seriously, but be aware that there are people for whom that's the template of history.
Yeah, and it does make sense to me that that part of the audience that he has played for is international, just not Western. People in other places with similarly minded regimes who might like to play the same game, and who this rhetoric might speak to. But yeah, with no further ado, we should get going. This is so this is like, I think about 10 seconds before we cut off last time. He is actually in he is I saw a meme the other day that they have it's like the sad line drawing, with the head stooped over, saying, please talk about present day. And Putin's head said, as I was saying, Yaroslav the Wise. But he is actually talking about pretty close to present day at this point,
as well as some other European countries. But then, as it turned out later, President Bush, and he's such a tough guy, a tough politician, as I was told later, he exerted pressure on us and we had to agree. It's ridiculous. It's like kindergarten. Where are the guarantees? What kindergarten is this? What kind of people are these? Who are they? You see, they were pressed, they agreed. And then they say, Ukraine won't be in the NATO, I say, I don't know. I know you agreed in 2008. Why won't you agree in the future? Well, they pressed us then. I say, why won't they press you tomorrow? And you'll agree again. Well, it's nonsensical. Who's there to talk to? I just don't understand. We're ready to talk. But with whom? Where are the guarantees? None. So they started to develop the territory of Ukraine. Whatever is there, I have told you the background, how this territory developed, what kind of relations there were with Russia. Every second or third person there has always had some ties with Russia. And during the elections in already independent, sovereign Ukraine, which gained its independence as a result of the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, it says that Ukraine is a neutral state, and in 2008, suddenly the doors or gates to NATO were open to it. Oh, come on. This is not how we agreed. Now, all the presidents that have come to power in Ukraine, they relied on electorate with a good attitude to Russia in one way or the other. This is the southeast of Ukraine. This is a large number of people. And it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate, which had a positive attitude towards Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power, and how? The first time he won after President Kuchma, they organized a third round, which is not provided for in the constitution of Ukraine. This is a coup d'etat. Just imagine, someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome.
In 2014?
Before that. No, this was before that. After President Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych won the elections. However, his opponents did not recognize that victory. The US supported the opposition, and the third round was scheduled. What is this? This is a coup. The US supported it, and the winner of the third round came to power. Imagine if in the US something was not to someone's liking, and the third round of election, which the US Constitution does not provide for, was organized. Nonetheless, it was done in Ukraine. Okay, Viktor Yushchenko, who was considered a pro-Western politician, came to power. Fine, we have built relations with him as well. He came to Moscow with visits. We visited Kiev. I visited too. We met in an informal setting. If he's pro-Western, so be it. It's fine. Let people do their job. The situation should have developed inside the independent Ukraine itself. As a result of Kuchma's leadership, things got worse, and Viktor Yanukovych came to power after all. Maybe he wasn't the best president and politician. I don't know. I don't want to give assessments. However, the issue of the association with the EU came up. We have always been lenient to this. Suit yourself. But when we read through the Treaty of Association, it turned out to be a problem for us, since we had a free trade zone and open customs borders with Ukraine, which under this association had to open its borders for Europe, which would have led to flooding of our market. We said, no, this is not going to work. We shall close our borders with Ukraine then. The customs borders, that is. Yanukovych started to calculate how much Ukraine was going to gain, how much to lose, and said to his European partners, I need more time to think before signing. The moment he said that, the opposition began to take destructive steps, which were supported by the West. It all came down to Maidan and a coup in Ukraine.
So he did more trade with Russia than with the EU. Ukraine did.
Of course. It's not even the matter of trade volume, although for the most part it is. It is the matter of cooperation ties, which the entire Ukrainian economy was based on. The cooperation ties between the enterprises were very close since the times of the Soviet Union. One enterprise there used to produce components to be assembled both in Russia and Ukraine, and vice versa. They used to be very close ties. A coup d'etat was committed, although I shall not delve into details now, as I find doing it inappropriate, the US told us. Calm Yanukovych down, and we will calm the opposition. Let the situation unfold in the scenario of a political settlement. We said, all right, agreed, let's do it this way. As the Americans requested, Yanukovych did use neither the armed forces nor the police, yet the armed opposition committed a coup in Kiev. What is that supposed to mean? Who do you think you are? I wanted to ask the then US leadership.
With the backing of whom?
With the backing of CIA, of course. The organization you wanted to join back in the day, as I understand. We should thank God they didn't let you in. Although, it is a serious organization. I understand. My former vis-a-vis in the sense that I served in the first main directorate, Soviet Union's intelligence service. They have always been our opponents. A job is a job. Technically, they did everything right. They achieved their goal of changing the government. However, from political standpoint, it was a colossal mistake. Surely it was political leadership's miscalculation. They should have seen what it would evolve into. So in 2008, the doors of NATO were opened for Ukraine. In 2014, there was a coup. They started persecuting those who did not accept the coup, and it was indeed a coup. They created a threat to Crimea, which we had to take under our protection. They launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with the use of aircraft and artillery against civilians. This is when it all started. There's a video of aircraft attacking Donetsk from above. They launched a large-scale military operation, then another one. When they failed, they started to prepare the next one. All this against the background of military development of this territory and opening of NATO's doors. How could we not express concern over what was happening? From our side, this would have been a culpable negligence. That's what it would have been. It's just that the US political leadership pushed us to the line we could not cross, because doing so could have ruined Russia itself. Besides, we could not leave our brothers in faith, in fact, a part of Russian people, in the face of this war machine.
But that was 8 years before the current conflict started. So what was the trigger for you? What was the moment where you decided you had to do this?
Initially, it was the coup in Ukraine that provoked the conflict. By the way, back then the representatives of 3 European countries, Germany, Poland, and France, arrived. They were the guarantors of the signed agreement between the government of Yanukovych and the opposition. They signed it as guarantors. Despite that, the opposition committed a coup, and all these countries pretended that they didn't remember that they were guarantors of the peaceful settlement. They just threw it in the stove right away, and nobody recalls that. I don't know if the US know anything about the agreement between the opposition and the authorities, and its 3 guarantors who, instead of bringing this whole situation back in the political field, supported the coup. Although it was meaningless, believe me, because President Yanukovych agreed to all conditions. He was ready to hold an early election, which he had no chance of winning, frankly speaking. Everyone knew that. Then why the coup? Why the victims? Why threatening Crimea? Why launching an operation in Donbass? This I do not understand. That is exactly what the miscalculation is.
Okay. That seems like a pretty good interval to stop at. He's actually up to 2014 now. So 2022 is getting close. I can feel it. But yeah, I mean, most of this is focused on the relationships with the U.S. That's a subject you can speak to more than I can, but it's sort of in broad strokes. I think the last 10 minutes what he's been talking about, I think sounds broadly plausible. Given what I know about this. I mean, the concern for the Ukrainian constitution is a bit much, coming from him, but otherwise, when he's talking about the sort of history of U.S.-Russia relations with regard to Ukraine, this sounds mostly right.
I think that it's important to recognize that Ukraine, in the period between the collapse of the Soviet Union and this conflict, was never a Western style. It was not Switzerland. It did not have effective governing institutions or a very clear relationship between the population at large, the public, and its rulers. You had the same kind of oligarch theft of the economy in Ukraine as you did in Russia. you had organized crime networks that were operating more or less with impunity. And there wasn't much to the constitutional order to protect, right? The government itself would routinely violate its obligations to its citizens. It wasn't a live charter. In that environment, both Russia and the West jockeyed for position. And there were a lot of reasons why Ukraine would lean more towards Russia than the West. Putin brought up some of them. There's the economic interrelationships dating back to the USSR. There's also the fact of language and culture. These aren't trivial. Certainly, Ukrainians have more in common with Russians than they do with Italians or Spaniards or Germans. So if during that period there had been some respect for Ukrainian sovereignty and some integrity on the part of great powers, and especially Western powers, in living up to their obligations and the agreements that they had made, then we would be in a very different position. But with utter disregard for the implications for Ukrainian politics or the lives of Ukrainians, both NATO and Russia cultivated favorites, conducted all kinds of, political and psychological, cultural operations, diplomatically tried to lure Ukraine one way or another. And on the one hand, this is just standard great power stuff. On the other hand, this is where it leads to. So I see people in the chat criticize my take on Russia for being too harsh, but I can say plenty about the terrible interference of Western powers in the political development of not just Ukraine itself, but the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. And
in Russia, right? Like that.
Absolutely. And in Russia.
Very famously
exactly.
for, on behalf of Yeltsin, which, ironically, without that, Vladimir Putin, might very well not be in power now.
Yeah, Putin is not paranoid. He has enemies, and he's identified them correctly. There's many in the West that would like to see him deposed, and Western powers have been working undeniably to try to weaken and isolate Russia ever since the end of the Soviet Union. Now, similarly, countries like Poland, Lithuania, and right now Ukraine, at least the Zelensky-based government, they also have enemies, the chief of which is Vladimir Putin. Now, I consider the security interests of Russia to be absolutely valid, but just as valid are those of other countries or Russian neighbors. And one cannot pretend that it's fanciful for countries all along the Russian border to fear Russian interference and aggression, because that's the track record. Similarly, I don't think that Belarus is out of line in intensifying its counterintelligence operations against possible Western or Polish interference, right? The Poles would love to have Lukashenko gone. Of course, they're going to try to interfere with that country. The issue isn't that there's one side that's doing things that are so much worse than the other side. The issue is that if we're going to get to any kind of durable peace or civilized coexistence, both sides have to knock this off.
Right. I mean, this is, there is something very odd about, the way that people talk about, like a preferred set of security concerns without, without acknowledging where the other ones come from, right? Like, so in the, people, like the sort of people who are, I think, relatively, like the people who are more sympathetic, than I am, obviously, to Putin will say reasonable things about why Russia would be afraid of NATO expansion, but sort of talk about it in this odd way that misses why, for example, Ukraine might be interested in pursuing NATO membership in the first place, right? Like that, which don't get me wrong. I mean, I would absolutely be in favor of, I think it was a terrible, idea to sort of hold out that possibility, and
It's cruel, actually, because
yeah,
there's no
totally.
intention of following through on it.
Yeah, no, and it led to disastrous consequences. Yeah, absolutely.
Not
But
just for Ukraine, but it happened previously in Georgia.
for sure, right? So yeah, I think that, I think that holding out the possibility of them joining NATO was wrong on any number of levels and shouldn't have happened. But I also think it's the most understandable thing in the world that they would pursue NATO membership, because of course they would, right? They have this
Precisely, the fault is not
this
on the
powerful
part of-
neighbor that they have very rational fears about.
Exactly. It's not the fault of the Jordans or the Ukrainians who, when they have a government that has reason to fear Russia, that is pursuing a policy that is not preferred by Moscow, you would seek powerful allies that might be able to protect you. It's the fault of NATO that they give unrealistic answers and behave in a way that undermines the security of the region. And that's part of the issue. But you also said that when it comes to these security arrangements, security sensitivities, people bring up one side but not the other. Right. Putin here talks about how in 2014, Ukraine threatened Crimea and interfered in the Donbass. Well, that's because Russian special forces had come into Ukraine. They had secured it and they had detached it from the rest of the country, and they were doing the same thing in the Donbass. Now, I'm not averse to changing borders if there's public, popular support for that kind of move. But to pretend that the Ukrainian moves were in an absolute vacuum, I think that one can absolutely criticize the unwillingness to work with Yanukovych, the unwillingness to honor deals made in the wake of the Maidan protests. Absolutely. But you can't complain that your troops are getting shot at by some country when you've sent them to occupy a province there.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be a little bit your fault.
Right. Yeah. It's the, the Boondocks episode with the robbery, it's like a liquor store robbery that's set up as a very thinly disguised allegory for the Iraq War. And there's a moment in that episode where one of the characters, sounding, genuinely shocked and mortified, says, "I can't believe they're shooting back."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's funny because typically the Americans that have that type of blind spot. We're the good guys. Obviously, we're here to do nothing wrong. So why are all these ungrateful Iraqis or Southeast Asians, or you name it, coming after us? But this is just the Russian version of that.
CIA did its job to complete the coup. I think one of the deputy secretaries of state said that it cost a large sum of money, almost 5 billion. But the political mistake was colossal. Why would they have to do that? All this could have been done legally, without victims, without military action, without losing Crimea. We would have never considered to even lift a finger if it hadn't been for the bloody developments on Maidan. Because we agreed with the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our borders should be along the borders of former Union's republics. We agreed to that. But we never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us. For decades, we kept asking, don't do this, don't do that. And what triggered the latest events? Firstly, the current Ukrainian leadership declared that it would not implement the Minsk agreements, which had been signed, as you know, after the events of 2014 in Minsk, where the plan of peaceful settlement in Donbass was set forth. But no, the current Ukrainian leadership, foreign minister, all other officials, and then president himself said that they don't like anything about the Minsk agreements. In other words, they were not going to implement it. A year or a year and a half ago, former leaders of Germany and France said openly to the whole world that they indeed signed the Minsk agreements, but they never intended to implement them. They simply led us by the nose.
Was there anyone for you to talk to? Did you call a U.S. President, Secretary of State, and say, if you keep militarizing Ukraine with NATO forces, this is going to be we're going to act?
We talked about this all the time. We addressed the United States and European countries' leadership to stop these developments immediately, to implement the Minsk agreements. Frankly speaking, I didn't know how we were going to do this, but I was ready to implement them. These agreements were complicated for Ukraine. They included lots of elements of those Donbass territories' independence. That's true. However, I was absolutely confident, and I'm saying this to you now. I honestly believe that if we managed to convince the residents of Donbass, and we had to work hard to convince them to return to the Ukrainian statehood, then gradually the wounds would start to heal. When this part of territory reintegrated itself into a common social environment, when the pensions and social benefits were paid again, all the pieces would gradually fall into place. No, nobody wanted that. Everybody wanted to resolve the issue by military force only. But we could not let that happen. And the situation got to the point when the Ukrainian side announced, no, we will not do anything. They also started preparing for military action. It was they who started the war in 2014. Our goal is to stop this war. And we did not start this war in 2022. This is an attempt to stop it.
Do you think you've stopped it now? I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification. This means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. This is one of the problems that we discussed during the negotiation process, which ended in Istanbul early this year. And it was not our initiative, because we were told by the Europeans, in particular, that it was necessary to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My counterparts in France and Germany said, how can you imagine them signing a treaty with a gun to their heads? The troops should be pulled back from Kiev. I said, all right. We withdrew the troops from Kiev. As soon as we pulled back our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin.
That statement that the reason for the Russian withdrawal from central Ukraine, from its positions around Kiev, was because of the progress made towards peace settlement in Istanbul, and as a final kind of goodwill gesture before that agreement was signed. This is a new assertion that Putin is introducing, and I don't know if it's true. It might be. What we know to be true is that far from that there was a considerable effort made to capture Kiev, and that the Russian advance on the city was halted by the Ukrainians. It wasn't just a matter of Putin deciding in the 11th hour to show mercy. There's a strong argument to be made that the decision was forced on him by Ukrainian resistance. I don't know which case is true. Could very well be that the Russian presence was much more successful than was reported, but just because Putin asserts this doesn't mean that it's true.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds false to me. I have to say, right? Like this seems, I mean, just calling.
I wish he had brought that letter rather than the one from
Yes.
Khmelnytsky.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, if he was going to bring documentary evidence for one of his claims, then rather than the one for the 17th century would have been very very useful if it was this one, because it's just if that were true, it would be very odd that we were learning this from this interview, right?
I also think that there's one piece that Putin doesn't talk about, which is the incoherence of the different factions inside the Western security apparatus. You had groups that just wanted to end the war as quickly as possible, return to a status quo, which was significantly preferable. Europe, the EU does contain plenty of, you can call them naive idealists, but diplomats that believe what they say and take their job seriously. But there's also a very powerful, shall we call it the deep state, right? Very powerful network of security institutions, military personnel, and intelligence agencies that have their own agenda. And what I think happened in both the Minsk agreement and the agreement in Istanbul was that those elements, the most hawkish parts of the security apparatus, got enough control so that they dictated the outcomes that they wanted against whatever resistance they had from other parts of the alliance. And what they like to do in those cases is brag about it after the fact to demonstrate that how clever they were and how powerful they are, while in the moment itself, perhaps another world was possible, another option existed. And the same is true of actors on the Russian side as well. Putin likes to show a mask of autocratic absolutism where the buck stops with him. He's the decision maker. But as we saw with the Wagner group, there are elements of the Russian state, including armed forces within it, that don't really answer to anybody but their own leaders, and are more than happy to act against the policy and the institutions, the Russian institutions and the Russian policy that doesn't suit them. So just like you have to be aware of what's going on in the shadows among Western intelligence agencies and Western think tanks, Western sub-Rosa forces, don't think that there's perfect discipline or cohesion on the Russian side either.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. I did see. So I actually accidentally closed the tab. So I think this is going to take us to where we pause, but we might have to adjust it a little bit.
And got prepared for a long-standing armed confrontation with the help of the United States. Theorists of independence and sovereignty, theorists.
Очень важный вопрос. Денацификация.
That is what I want to talk about right now. It is a very important,
Очень важно.
and it was not our initiative, because we were told by the Europeans, in particular, that it was necessary to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My counterparts in
I
France
think
and
this is about
Germany
as close
said,
as we're going to get.
Германия говорит, ну как ты себе представляешь, как они будут...
Okay, then let's talk over him while he's repeating
Yeah,
stuff.
their heads
The
should be pulled
he's going to
back
bring
from
this
Kiev.
up, but
I said, all right.
one
We
of the
withdrew
strongest
the troops from
pieces
Kiev.
of evidence of that the meddling of NATO powers prolonged the war was, of course, Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev. He basically promised a blank check for aid, said he spoke for everybody, and urged the Ukrainians to reject Russian terms and fight on to victory. You know, all that Churchill stuff. I think that this is another case where Western dishonesty about NATO, about what it's willing to do to protect a country on the Russian borderlands, was cruel and irresponsible, merely prolonging the war. But one, we'll see, because while it seems like right now the Russians are on the offensive, this war has swung back and forth several times and may continue to do so. And also, it appears like the money is drying up. The latest American aid package has been pulled up as a result of stupid Democrat, Republican wrangling. And it's possible that after the presidential election, there might be a change in policy, especially if Trump is elected. But all that remains to be seen.
Yeah, fair. I think we are very close to, let's see. I think we're very close to where we cut off here. Oh, no.
Извините, от Киева.
As soon as we pulled back our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin and got prepared for a long-standing armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe. That is how the situation has developed, and that is how it looks now.
Да.
But what is, pardon my ignorance, what is denazification? What would that mean? What is,
Да, вот я как раз хочу сейчас об этом сказать. Это очень важный вопрос. Денацификация.
That is what I want to talk about right now. It is a very important issue. Denazification.
Искать, как говорят некоторые аналитики.
After gaining independence, Ukraine began to search, as some Western analysts say,
Как
its
поставить
identity.
во главу угла этой идентичности.
And it came up with nothing better than to build this identity upon some false heroes who collaborated with Hitler.
Которые сотрудничали с Гитлером. Я уже говорил, что
I have already said that in the early 19th century, when the theorists of independence and sovereignty of Ukraine appeared, they assumed that an independent Ukraine should have very good relations with Russia.
Но в силу исторического развития
But due to the historical development, those territories were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland, where Ukrainians were persecuted and treated quite brutally, as well as were subject to cruel behavior.
идентичность.
This is,
Очень жестоко. Это все осталось в
I
памяти.
mean, this
There
is
were
just
also
wrong.
attempts to destroy
though.
their
Poland, Lithuania wasn't worse to Ukrainians than any other mid-century, medieval Renaissance era dynastic state in Europe. They were probably better off than in Russia. During the interwar period, the Soviet plan was actually to make Ukrainians so comfortable and included in the USSR that their co-nationals across the border in Poland would seek to break away from Poland, join the USSR, enter the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. But after the Holodomor, conditions in Ukraine were so much worse than in Poland that it led to persecution of Ukrainians on the Soviet side, because they worried that Ukrainian nationalists, even ones within the Bolshevik Party or ones with leftist sympathies, would prefer the deal offered by Poland. And so the relationship between Poland and Ukraine, frankly, is no different than the one between Russia and Ukraine. You know, an occasional conqueror with a very mixed record and deep historical kinship. And I'll leave it at that. But the right now, contemporary Ukraine is both drawing on the old historical connections going all the way back to the Kiev and Rus. You know, in Kiev, they also like Yaroslav the Wise. But apart from that part of the culture that is used to promote a sense of Ukrainian identity, a number of collaborationist, anti-Soviet nationalist fighters, right? Terrorists, anti-Semites, Nazis, mass murderers, people like Stepan Bandera, have been rehabilitated and promoted. And it is bad and it is fucked up, but it is not everything. It's a much more mixed situation than Putin would have you believe. By his logic, denazification is the same as de-Ukrainianization, because Ukrainian identity apparently just comes down to loving these Hitler collaborators.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it's the whole denazification thing was always, you know, was always like one of the most ridiculous parts of the Russian case, right? I mean, that they, like, you know, Putin himself has shown absolutely no like inhibitions about working with far right forces, you know, with that, you know, when that matches his agenda. And, you know, it's you know, he's not wrong that the Ukrainian far right is real and disturbing and a problem, right? But it is a bit hard to take seriously the idea that that was ever part of his motivation.
Well, I think that he, precisely because he deals with those kinds of forces, knows how dangerous they can be. And he doesn't intend on allowing groups like that are inimical to his interests to organize, perhaps even take over a state, capture a state that would be able to threaten Russia. I also think that we talked a little about how his rhetoric about historical territorial legacies matches up with that of China. I think here he may be borrowing a template from Israel. And what he's proposing is essentially a type of political veto, protectorship over whatever Ukrainian state emerges after this conflict, on the basis of denazification, right? Like, just like Hamas legitimates any kind of interference in Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian day-to-day life, so too this vague notion of denazification could serve that role whenever Russia in the future would want to flex hard power in its relationship with a rump Ukrainian state.
Yeah, exactly. But have you condemned Azov?
Actually, I'm shipping Azov and Hamas, right? Like I have them both. I've got an anime waifu version of both of them, and they're like a librarian lesbian couple. You know, one of them is the dangerous one. One of them like wants to sit home and drink tea on rainy nights. Yeah, they go on adventures and everything. It's adorable.
Nice. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, right. And I do agree with Jeb to the chat saying, that they, Azov shouldn't be discounted. Hamas shouldn't be discounted, right? Like that's, Hamas is a major player. They do things. But I think the other comment, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce Charles, that it works as rhetoric in Russia because there's a kernel of truth there. I think is exactly right. Like you could say the same thing about Hamas, that these forces are real, they exist, they're a problem, right? But I think the inference that should be resisted is making them sort of a all-purpose free pass for doing whatever you want in response to them. And that is also a double standard I see quite a bit, right? That it's kind of the same way that there are people who spent the sort of crucial years of the Western War on Terror having what I would view as the right attitude towards that, and being opposed to all of the wars that were fought, in its name and etc. But who when the war in Syria started, thought that the cause of, that there was no problem at all with using barrel bombs if the people that you were bombing were Al Qaeda. I think that's, I think that's where, anti-imperialism could become very stupid and start to sound disconcertingly close to neocon rhetoric in a weird way, right? Just with just very selectively.
The position of real integrity to me would seem to be to apply the same standard of conduct with respect to human rights on everybody and expect nobody to actually live up to it. The states are ruthless. States, the type of competition they're involved in leaves bodies, sometimes by the thousands. And we can rank some as better than others or look at particular cases where the rules were better obeyed than in other ones. But whether or not I'm a little concerned that, like you pointed out, it comes down to how much you dislike the particular civilians being killed. If they're Zionists or counter-revolutionaries or, NATO bootlickers, then sure, barrel bombs for everybody. And we only care about victims when they check all the right boxes for our side. Look, a dead family is a dead family. I don't particularly care what language they spoke or what their views on politics were.
Or more likely what their leaders' views on politics were, since they, themselves
precisely.
Probably had very little.
Exactly. Yeah. Most of the ghosts you would summon over Gaza or the Donbass would just want to talk about soccer and girls.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's obviously true and extremely compelling at a moral level. I would also point out that there's this counter argument that also has a rational kernel to it that people will bring up, where they say, look, as a sort of American leftist, since, one, anything you can hope to exert any kind of influence about, however little, right, is American foreign policy. And in any case, the US, is like responsible for such an outsized share of, building up the corpses that, that you should really focus on that. And but what I would say to that is that, yeah, look, I mean, at a certain level, I agree that is what you should focus on, but you're not serving the cause of opposing those things by being an obvious hypocrite, right? Like if you say, I don't care about dead civilians if, they were killed by, some force that happens to be a geopolitical conflict with the United States, then that undermines your ability to convince anybody that they should be concerned about dead civilians in Gaza, for example, right? That if you're just obviously being opportunistic about it, right? And there's no more general principle like that, that's not only bad from a sort of view from 10,000 feet moral level, although God knows it is. It's also strategically counterproductive that, this is, I mean, if you're, if you want to, if you want to convince people of ceasefire now, and, you're probably not going to be able to convince them of your entire view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the time scale that you want to convince them of that, right? Then your best tool towards that end is the instinctive moral horror that normal people hold towards seeing the slaughter of civilians. And, if if you're just obviously incredibly selective about when you find that objectionable, then, it's what you're doing isn't even going to work on its own terms, and shouldn't work on its own terms. So, I think that the oars are pointed in the same direction here as far as sort of basic human decency and the political imperatives of getting people to stop the thing that we agree that, we should be focused on.
Yeah, I think that there's a temptation on the part of people who follow these types of geopolitical developments, get interested in the history, to take on, to absolutely reject the Western counterintelligence, dirty tricks, Tom Clancy mindset, but create their own, which is just a transposed version of it with the, badass white hat KGB agents and the axis of resistance heroically overcoming the forces of imperialism. And it's like, two things can be bad, guys, right? And if you really are concerned about if some sympathetic state, like to pick one, which I think a lot of Westerners celebrate appropriately, Rojava, the left anarchist Kurdish enclave in Syria. Protecting Rojava probably means doing a lot of brutal things. They were in a war against ISIS, after all. And they continue to be bedeviled by the Turks, the Syrian government. And the situation is extraordinarily dangerous for them under conditions which might justify, right, might require, rather, committing things that might be considered war crimes. And I wouldn't judge them for it. But you don't have to take that role. There's somebody in Rojava who's making those decisions. You don't have to hypothetically jump into the skin of a whatever anti-imperial intelligence agent, special forces guy, right, like a militia leader, you feel like, and try to channel those justifications. It's fine if people that you might be sympathetic with do bad things that warrant condemnation. You can still sympathize with them, but don't lose sight of the fact that, yeah, there's, to quote a very great man, our side has killers too.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And again, I just don't think it, I think that you can sort of be accurate. I don't really find, I don't really find that kind of perspective like that blanking on the term, but I don't find standpoint epistemology any more plausible when it comes to geopolitics than in any other context, right? I think that regardless of your identity, right, whether you're an American or anything else, you can and should say accurate things about the world around you to the best of your ability, and you can and should apply consistent standards. I don't. Yeah, I think identity politics is like I think the stupidities of identity politics don't get less stupid when the identity that we're talking about is the global South or some sort of notion of anybody who's standing up against America or etc. And again, I would really question whether it even serves the political cause that people who say stuff like this think that it's serving to say it. And I guess my last, I think you could just acknowledge the world as it is, right? You can acknowledge that sometimes two things are bad. Sometimes, in some situations, there are actually as many as 3 or 4 different things that are all bad.
Identity.
Когда началась Вторая мировая война, часть этой
All this remained in the memory of the people. When World War II broke out, part of this extremely nationalist elite collaborated with Hitler, believing that he would bring them freedom.
она начала сотрудничать с Гитлером.
The German troops, even the SS troops, made Hitler's collaborators do the dirtiest work of exterminating the Polish and Jewish population. Hence this brutal massacre of the Polish and Jewish population, as well as the Russian population too. This was led by the persons who are well known, Bandera, Shukevich. It was those people who were made national heroes. That is the problem. And we are constantly told that nationalism and neo-Nazism exist in other countries as well. Yes, they are seedlings, but we uproot them, and other countries fight against them. But Ukraine is not the case. These people have been made into national heroes in Ukraine. Monuments to those people have been erected. They are displayed on flags. Their names are shouted by crowds that walk with torches, as it was in Nazi Germany. These were people who exterminated Poles, Jews, and Russians.
Oh, forgive me, Vladimir, but
It is necessary
now
to
you
stop
care about
this
the
practice
Poles?
and prevent the dissemination of this concept. I say that Ukrainians are part of the one Russian people. They say, no, we are a separate people. Okay, fine. If they consider themselves a separate people, they have the right to do so, but not on the basis of Nazism, the Nazi ideology.
Would you be satisfied with the territory that you have now?
Нет, закончим. Вы же задали вопрос по неонацизму и денацификации.
I will finish answering the question. You just asked a question about neo-Nazism and denazification. Look, the president of Ukraine visited Canada. This story is well known, but being silenced in the Western countries. The Canadian Parliament introduced a man who, as the Speaker of the Parliament said, fought against the Russians during the World War II. Well, who fought against the Russians during the World War II? Hitler and his accomplices. It turned out that this man served in the SS troops. He personally killed Russians, Poles, and Jews. The SS troops consisted of Ukrainian nationalists who did this dirty work. The president of Ukraine stood up with the entire Parliament of Canada and applauded this man. How can this be imagined? The president of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years. Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so, I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism. But how? How do you do that?
Вот послушайте меня. Ваш вопрос очень тонкий.
Listen to me. Your question is very
Можно я
subtle,
скажу, как я думаю?
and I can tell you what I think. Do not take offense.
Of course.
Он, казалось бы, тонкий, он очень противный, этот вопрос.
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky.
Значит,
You say
но
Hitler has
дело
been
его
dead
живет.
for so many years,
Люди, которые
80 years. But
уничтожали
his
евреев,
example
русских,
lives
и
on.
поляков, живы.
People who exterminated
И
Jews,
президент,
Russians, and
действующий
Poles are
президент
alive.
сегодняшней Украины
And the
аплодирует
president, the
ему в
current
канадском
president of
парламенте,
today's Ukraine,
аплодирует,
applauds him
стоя.
in the Canadian parliament,
Разве мы
gives
можем
a
сказать, что
standing
мы
ovation.
целиком выкорчевали
Can we
эту
say that
идеологию,
we have
если
completely
то, что мы
uprooted
видим,
this
происходит
ideology
сегодня?
if what we see is
Вот что
happening
такое
today?
денацификация в нашем
That is what
Надо
denazification
избавиться от
is
тех
in
людей,
our
которые
understanding.
эту
We have to get rid of those people who
теорию,
maintain
практику
this concept and support this
оставляют в
practice
жизни
and
и
try to
стараются
preserve it.
сохранить.
That
Вот
is
что
what
такое
denazification
денацификация.
is.
Вот
That
что мы под
is
этим
what we
понимаем.
mean.
Right. My question was a little more specific. It was, of course, not a defense of Nazis, neo or otherwise. It was a practical question. You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
А вот знаете, как вам не покажется странным, в ходе переговоров в Стамбуле,
You know,
что переговорили
as strange as it may seem to you, during the negotiations in Istanbul, we did agree that we have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. Mr. Carson, we agreed on that. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. And there's nothing humiliating for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
Will there be talks, and why haven't there been talks about resolving the conflict in Ukraine, peace talks?
Они были, они дошли до очень высокой стадии согласования позиций, сложно.
They have been. They reached a very high stage of coordination of positions in a complex process, but still they were almost finalized. But after we withdrew our troops from Kiev, as I have already said, the other side threw away all these agreements and obeyed the instructions of Western countries, European countries, and the United States to fight Russia to the bitter end. Moreover, the president of Ukraine has legislated a ban on negotiating with Russia. He signed a decree forbidding everyone to negotiate with Russia. But how are we going to negotiate if he forbade himself and everyone to do this? We know that he is putting forward some ideas about this settlement, but in order to agree on something, we need to have a dialogue. Is that not right?
Well, but you wouldn't be speaking to the Ukrainian president, you'd be speaking to the American president. When was the last time you spoke to Joe Biden?
I cannot remember when I talked to him. I do not remember. We can look it up.
You don't remember?
No. Why? Do I have to remember everything? I have my own things to do. We have domestic political affairs.
Well, he's funding the war that you're fighting, so I would think that would be memorable.
Well, yes, he funds, but I talked to him before the special military operation, of course. And I said to him then, by the way, I will not go into details, I never do, but I said to him then, I believe that you are making a huge mistake of historic proportions by supporting everything that is happening there, in Ukraine, by pushing Russia away. I told him repeatedly, by the way. I think that would be correct if I stop here.
What did he say?
Ask him, please. It is easier for you. You are a citizen of the United States. Go and ask him. It is not appropriate for me to comment on our conversation.
But you haven't spoken to him since before February of 2022.
No, we haven't spoken. Certain contacts are being maintained, though. Speaking of which, Do you remember what I told you about my proposal to work together on a missile defense system?
Yes.
Да. Вот можно спросить у всех. Они же
You
все
can ask
здоровы,
all of
живы,
them.
здоровы.
All of them
И,
are safe and sound, thank God.
бывший президент,
The former president, Condoleezza, is safe and sound. And I think Mr. Gates and the current director of the intelligence agency, Mr. Burns, the then ambassador to Russia, in my opinion, are very
Yes.
successful ambassador.
они все свидетели этих потоков.
They were all witnesses to these conversations.
То же самое,
Ask
если
them.
вам интересно, что ответил
Same here. If you are interested in what Mr. President Biden responded to me, ask him. At any rate, I talked to him about it.
I'm definitely interested, but from the outside, it seems like this could devolve or evolve into something that brings the entire world into conflict and could initiate a nuclear launch. And so why don't you just call Biden and say, let's work this out?
А что решить? Все очень... всё
What's
очень
there
просто.
to work out?
Именно
It's very
у
simple.
нас,
I repeat,
есть контакты по линии там различных
we have
агентств.
contacts through various agencies.
Я вам скажу, что мы говорим на этот счет.
I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it.
Тогда можно договориться.
And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that,
Что проще?
stop.
Чё?
What's easier? Why would I call him?
Или-
What should I talk to him about? Or beg him for what?
And what
А вы
messages do you
собираетесь
get back?
поставить такое-то оружие на Украину?
You're going to deliver such and such weapons to Ukraine? Oh, I'm afraid. Please don't. What is there to talk about?
Do you think NATO is worried about this becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict?
At least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people, understand perfectly well that this is a fake.
Раздувается.
They're trying to fuel the Russian threat.
The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Только в одном случае, если со стороны...
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia.
Поэтому-
Why?
поэтому тут
Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that?
Although
We simply
I
don't
would
have
point
any
out
interest.
that
It's just-
elsewhere, Putin says that there's a war already going on with NATO, that there is a war, that Russia has been attacked by NATO, by the West. Sometimes he calls out Poland by name. So this is a very disingenuous answer.
Yeah, right. He's definitely trying to have a couple of different ways here. I mean, I guess the sort of more honest reassurance he could give, though, I could see why he wouldn't want to give it, is like, come on, look at how disastrous we've gotten bogged down in Ukraine without being able to take them back out that much of the country. Do you think we have the capacity?
Yeah, although if he said that, I would immediately assume that all of our statistics, all of our data on Russian industrial production and losses, military losses in Ukraine have been falsified, and that there's a bunch of secret divisions sitting somewhere in Belarus.
It's threat mongering.
Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine. He has territorial aims across the continent. And you're saying unequivocally you don't.
Это абсолютно исключено.
It is absolutely out of the
Не надо
question.
быть никаким аналитиком.
You just don't have to be any kind of analyst. It goes against common sense to get involved in some kind of a global war.
Глобальная война поставить на грань.
And a global war will bring all humanity to the brink of destruction. It's obvious.
Вот. И Есть, конечно, средства.
There are certainly means of deterrence. They have been scaring everyone with us all along. Tomorrow, Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tomorrow, Russia will use that. No, the day after tomorrow. So what?
Выбить из налогоплательщиков
In order to
США
extort additional money from US taxpayers and European taxpayers in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible.
One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
Это провокация.
This is a provocation, and a cheap provocation at that.
Американские солдаты должны воевать.
I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place and mercenaries from Georgia in third place.
Безусловно.
Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the
Note
brink
that,
of very serious global conflict.
The Poles, etc., are mercenaries, but he doesn't really have anything to say about groups like Chechens brought in from by Islam Karimov, or other groups recruited from the Russian year abroad. Like, it's honestly, there's plenty of Western volunteers, of course, many Poles that are fighting in Ukraine on behalf of the side that sort of fits with their national interest. And the same is true of the other side.
Yeah, which, none of which is particularly surprising, and and it's not it. It's
Par
also
for the
like,
course.
okay, what's the objection to the foreigners or to the mercenaries? We know it's not to the mercenaries, because Putin
Wagner.
famously, until very recently, was making heavy use of a subcontractor for the war, and we know it's not the foreigners because again, the Chechens, etc. Right? So yeah, this is a confusing objection. It's also it's also always just a little bit much, right? When you've invaded a country and then you complain about the existence of other foreign troops in the country, right? That this is,
How dare they?
Yeah, like, okay. If non-Ukrainians being in Ukraine is a problem, then perhaps the search for a solution to that problem starts at home. But yeah, let's keep going.
This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia, make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? And realizing this, actually return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions. It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
I was busy that day.
Yeah, definitely
Nate,
Western
do you have-
intelligence agencies. No question. I can't really get any more specific than that, and I'm going to claim that it's because I don't know. But if you want to believe something else, then I won't stop you. But yeah, definitely 100% Nord Stream was a was a job carried out by Western intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy like that there was a good, I don't know, week there right after it happened when Western mainstream media was giving all of this time to these like Nord Stream was an inside job conspiracy theories that, you know, that like kind of made no sense on the face of him, that like the motivation was always confusing at best. And, you know, and like, it's not, I think it's something that rightly wouldn't be taken seriously, you know, if the shoe were on the other foot, right? That that's like, oh, they probably did that themselves for some reason to, you know, show that they were really serious about, you know, sabotaging their own economy, you know, going going forward. Like, why?
I mean, the one group that I'm fairly confident wasn't involved, apart from Russians, is the Germans, because the biggest victims, the two countries that have the most to lose economically, are Russia and Germany. I think that it was meant to sever the economic connection between the two and solidify Germany's the reality that Germany only has the NATO option. And Norwegians are in NATO. Yeah, there was the Hirsch article that detailed what may have been the specific group and the specific steps that brought about the destruction of Nord Stream. And it seems entirely plausible. But even if it didn't take place that way, then it would just be a matter of different Western operators and different Western agencies. Yeah, and when I say Western, that doesn't mean to preclude Ukrainian involvement directly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, whoever sort of did it specifically, you know, it's, you know, like Ukrainians or a NATO power or a combination of the two, you know, like that, those seem like the options, but, you know, I mean, like even putting aside all investigative journalism that's been done on this and the competing claims and counterclaims about all that, I mean, those are the only options that make sense.
Absolutely.
I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби. У вас лично.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Знаете,
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the biggest European media are American financial institutions. Don't you know that? So it is possible to get involved in this work, but it is cost prohibitive, so to speak. We can simply shine the spotlight on our sources of information, and we will not achieve results. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly. It's true.
Yes, but here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, but it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
Ну, меня это тоже удивляет.
This also confuses me. But today's German leadership is guided by the interests of the collective West rather than its national interests. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their action or inaction. After all, it is not only about Nord Stream 1, which was blown up, and the Nord Stream 2 was damaged. But one pipe is safe and sound, and gas can be supplied to Europe through it. But Germany does not open it. We're ready, please. There's another route through Poland called Yamal Europe, which also allows for large flow. Poland has closed it, but Poland pecks from the German hand. It receives money from the pan-European funds, and Germany is the main donor to these pan-European funds. Germany feeds Poland to a certain extent, and they close their route to Germany. Why? I don't understand. Ukraine, to which the Germans supply weapons and give money. Germany is the second sponsor of the United States in terms of financial aid to Ukraine. There are two gas routes through Ukraine. They simply closed one route, the Ukrainians. Open the second route and please get gas from Russia. They do not open it. Why don't the Germans say, look guys, we give you money and weapons, open up the valve, please, let the gas from Russia pass through for us. We're buying liquefied gas at exorbitant prices in Europe, which brings the level of our competitiveness and economy in general down to zero. Do you want us to give you money? Let us have the decent existence. Make money for our economy, because this is where the money we give you comes from. They refuse to do so. Why? Ask them. That is what is like in their heads. Those are highly incompetent people.
Well, maybe the world is breaking into two hemispheres, one with cheap energy, the other without. And I want to ask you that. If we're now a multipolar world, obviously we are, can you describe the blocks of alliances? Who is in each side, do you think?
Послушайте, вы сказали, мир разделяется на...
Listen, you have said that the world is breaking into two hemispheres. A human brain is divided into two hemispheres.
одну сферу деятельности, другая более креативная.
One is responsible for one type of activities, the other one is more about creativity and so on. But it is still one and the same head. The world should be a single whole. Security should be shared rather than meant for the golden billion. That is the only scenario where the world could be stable, sustainable, and predictable. Until then, while the head is split in two parts, it is an illness, a serious adverse condition. It is a period of severe disease that the world is going through now. But I think that thanks to honest journalism, this work is akin to work of the doctors. This could somehow be remedied.
Well, let's just...
Yeah, that's some very very kumbaya-ish thoughts from Vladimir Putin at the end there, with the analogy about human brains. I guess what it makes me think is that, I mean, it's like there's a level in which it's obviously kind of absurd, right? I mean, that like his, he would have to act very differently in a world that actually had strong enough international institutions to enforce the kind of meaningfully universal collective security that he's talking about. But, but I mean, I could also, I could also see that, he's, it certainly doesn't cost him anything to talk that way, and so I guess I can see why he is.
And when someone like Putin presents this idea, he is more likely to imagine something like the Concert of Europe, where a few great powers meet regularly in order to, figure out how to suppress their minorities in a coordinated and effective manner, as well as keep a kibosh on the Jacobins and socialists and atheists and other unruly types. The one of the great legacies of the mid-century period of diplomacy and the World War II alliance against Hitler was the United Nations and the genuinely internationalized staff and institutional structures that it created. And that might be a best case scenario for what he's proposing, and it would be a much better way to try to run international security than what we have now. Infinitely more desirable. So I can't really disagree with him on that being a much more desirable situation than the one that we find ourselves in. I'm not George W. Bush. I haven't peered into his soul, so I won't question the authenticity of his commitment to it. But if others want to.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and I just don't, I guess with regards to some of what's been in the chat, like I just don't think you're getting an accurate understanding of the world if you see the United States as the sole force that's exercising any sort of agency, and you think everybody else is just kind of responding to things that the U.S. does. I just don't think that's true. I think that the U.S. obviously has more power than than any other single country globally. Like that's also clearly true. And I think you could solidly oppose the imperialist behavior of the United States without having that sort of everything is just the United States doing things and other people haplessly responded to them picture of the world. I don't think you have to pick. And yeah, I do think that the very long-term solution is as difficult as it is to imagine it right now is at least the nicer interpretation, the less Congress of Europe-y, more genuinely, democratized global institutions, version of what he said. But yeah, I mean, what he said, if you believed that, that he believed that and weren't interested in sort of dominating, his sphere of influence and all of that stuff quite independently of what the U.S. might do. It's like, yeah, everything he said, it's like, yes, correct. Good. Amen, Vladimir.
To give one example, the U.S. dollar, which has kind of united the world in a lot of ways, maybe not to your advantage, but certainly to ours. Is that going away as the reserve currency, the universally accepted currency? How have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
To use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the U.S. political leadership. The dollar is the cornerstone of the United States power. I think everyone understands very well that no matter how many dollars are printed, they are quickly dispersed all over the world. Inflation in the United States is minimal. It's about 3 or 3.4%, which is, I think, totally acceptable for the US. But they won't stop printing. What does the debt of $33 trillion tell us about? It is about the emission. Nevertheless, it is the main weapon used by the United States to preserve its power across the world. As soon as the political leadership decided to use the US dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power. I would not like to use any strong language, but it is a stupid thing to do and a grave mistake. Look at what is going on in the world. Even the United States allies are now downsizing their dollar reserves. Seeing this, Everyone starts looking for ways to protect themselves. But the fact that the United States applies restrictive measures to certain countries, such as placing restrictions on transactions, freezing assets, etc., causes grave concern and sends a signal to the whole world. What did we have here? Until 2022, about 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were made in US dollars and euros. US dollars accounted for approximately 50% of our transactions with third countries, while currently it is down to 13%. It wasn't us who banned the use of the US dollar.
США приняли решение ограничить наши расчеты в долларах.
We had no such intention. It was decision of the United States to restrict our transactions in US dollars. I think it is complete foolishness from the point of view of the interests of the United States itself and its taxpayers, as it damages the US economy, undermines the power of the United States across the world. By the way, our transactions in yuan accounted for about 3%.
Сейчас 34%
Today, 34% of our transactions are made in rubles and about as much, a little over 34% in yuan.
Зачем Соединенные Штаты?
Why did the United States do this? My only guess is self-conceit.
Думали, наверное, что
They
всё
probably thought it would
I mean-
lead to full collapse, but nothing collapsed. Moreover, other countries, including oil producers, are thinking of and already accepting payments for oil in yuan. Do you even realize what is going on or not?
Вы понимаете, что это такое происходит?
Does anyone in the United States realize this?
Понимаете, тех же Соединенных Штатов, что
What are you doing? You are cutting yourself
сами
off.
себе
All
обретаете
experts say this.
то, что всегда у
Ask
всех
any
экспертов
intelligent and thinking person in the United States what the dollar means for the US.
Что
But-
такое доллар?
You're killing it with your own hands.
Убиваете.
I think that's I think that's a fair assessment. The question is what comes next, and maybe you trade one colonial power for another, much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean, is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy in a way that's not good for their sovereignty? Do you worry about that?
Эти страшилки нам
Well, we have heard those boogeyman stories before. It is a boogeyman story. We're neighbors with China. You cannot choose neighbors just as you cannot choose close relatives. We share a border of 1,000 kilometers with them. This is number one. Second, we have a centuries-long history of coexistence. We're used to it. Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is not aggressive. Its idea is to always look for compromise, and we can see that. The next point is as follows. We are always told the same boogeyman story, and here it goes again, through an euphemistic form, but it is still the same boogeyman story. The cooperation with China keeps increasing. The pace at which China's cooperation with Europe is growing is higher and greater than that of the growth of Chinese-Russian cooperation. Ask Europeans, aren't they afraid? They might be, I don't know. But they are still trying to access China's market at all costs, especially now that they are facing economic problems.
и китайские.
Chinese businesses are also exploring the European market. Do Chinese businesses have small presence in the United States? Yes, the political decisions are such that they are trying to limit their cooperation with China. It is to your own detriment, Mr. Tucker, that you are limiting cooperation with China. You are hurting yourself. It is a delicate matter, and there are no silver bullet solutions, just as it is with the dollar. So, before introducing any illegitimate sanctions, illegitimate in terms of the Charter of the United Nations, one should think very carefully. For decision makers, this appears to be a problem.
So you said a moment ago that the world would be a lot better if it weren't broken into competing alliances, if there was cooperation globally. one of the reasons you don't have that is because the current American administration is dead set against you. Do you think if there were a new administration after Joe Biden that you would be able to reestablish communication with the US government? Or does it not matter who the president is?
Сейчас скажу, но чтобы закончить предыдущий вопрос.
I will tell you, but let me finish the previous thought. We, together with my colleague and friend, President Xi Jinping, set a goal to reach $200 billion of mutual trade with China this year. We have exceeded this level. According to our figures, our bilateral trade with China totals already $230 billion, and the Chinese statistics says it is $240 billion. One more important thing. Our trade is well balanced, mutually complementary in high tech, energy, scientific research, and development. It is very balanced. As for BRICS, where Russia took over the presidency this year, the BRICS countries are, by and large, developing very rapidly. Look, if memory serves me right, back in 1992, the share of the G7 countries in the world economy amounted to 47%, whereas in 2022, it was down to, I think, a little over 30%. The BRICS countries accounted for only 16% in 1992, but now their share is greater than that of the G7. It has nothing to do with the events in Ukraine. This is due to the trends of global development and world economy, as I mentioned just now. And this is inevitable. This will keep happening. It is like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. You have to adapt to it. How do the United States adapt? With the help of force, sanctions, pressure, bombings, and use of armed forces. This is about self-conceit.
At the risk of getting repetitive here, I am charmed by how much Putin is offended by trying to solve geopolitical problems by bombings and the use of force.
This is true. It's not as though Ukraine is his first war either, right? Like, not even his first foreign war. So I think that, but putting that aside, his discussion of the economic shift away from the G7 countries towards the BRICS, all of that is fairly plausible.
Mm-hmm.
I would be careful about putting too much emphasis on the idea of some kind of coordination among BRICS, that this is more than, at this point, a very immature and potentially overbroad collection, right? There's only a few points of common interest that unite all of the membership. But then again, from a start on one or two issues, it might be possible to grow more substantive coordination and cooperation. Frankly, I've got no problem with some kind of BRICS-based order, so long as it plays a constructive role and doesn't represent a threat to its own people or to others, you know, unlike NATO. But so long as I think there's a perfectly constructive place in the world for that kind of organization, and I wouldn't mind seeing it. I wouldn't hold your breath, though. I guess that's my point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, try to figure out how much that's just kind of that construction actually represents anything real, right? You know, that obviously the Russia-China part of the acronym is one thing, right? But but the Brazil India part, it's like I mean I know I don't know. I mean, it's like I think that I think Brazil, for example, is does I mean I think has shown like a fairly robust amount of independence from U.S. Foreign policy, especially since Lula took over again. Like that's true, right? But also I think pretty clearly there's a line that they're walking there. Right, it's yeah.
And India, which has more independence because it's further away from the United States and has more robust security institutions, also a billion people. Their optimum strategy is not to go all in on the BRICS, but to say yes, do what they can, benefit what they can from those relationships, while also using it to cut a better deal with the West. And you see India playing both sides in that way. Nothing wrong with that, but it is much too early to conclude that there's any kind of ideological vision or commitment on the part of the BRICS members beyond working out some of their practical interests.
Yeah.
Your political establishment does not understand that the world is changing under objective circumstances. And in order to preserve your level, even if someone aspires, pardon me, to the level of dominance, you have to make the right decisions in a competent and timely manner. Such brutal actions, including with regard to Russia and, say, other countries, are counterproductive. This is an obvious fact. It has already become evident. You just asked me if another leader comes and changes something. It is not about the leader. It is not about the personality of a particular person. I had a very good relationship with, say, Bush. I know that in the United States, he was portrayed as some kind of a country boy who does not understand much. I assure you that this is not the case. I think he made a lot of mistakes with regard to Russia, too. I told you about 2008 and the decision in Bucharest to open the NATO's doors for Ukraine and so on. That happened during his presidency. He actually exercised pressure on the Europeans. But in general, on a personal human level, I had a very good relationship with him. He was no worse than any other American or Russian or European politician. I assure you, he understood what he was doing as well as others. I had such personal relationship with Trump as well. It is not about the personality of the leader. It is about the elite's mindset. If the idea of domination at any cost, based also on forceful actions, dominates the American society, nothing will change. It will only get worse. But if, in the end, one comes to the awareness that the world has been changing due to the objective circumstances, and that one should be able to adapt to them in time, using the advantages that the US still has today, then perhaps something may change. Look, China's economy has become the first economy in the world in purchasing power parity. In terms of volume, it overtook the US a long time ago. The USA comes second, then India, 1.5 billion people, and then Japan, with Russia in the fifth place. Russia was the first economy in Europe last year, despite all the sanctions and restrictions. Is it normal from your point of view? Sanctions, restrictions, impossibility of payments in dollars, being cut off from SWIFT services, sanctions against our ships carrying oil, sanctions against airplanes, sanctions in everything, everywhere. The largest number of sanctions in the world which are applied against Russia. And we have become Europe's first economy during this time.
Но надо же подумать.
The tools that US uses don't work. Well, one has to think about what to do. If this realization comes to the ruling elites, then yes, then the first person of the state will act in anticipation of what the voters and the people who make decisions at various levels expect from this person. Then maybe something will change.
But you're describing two different systems. You say the leader acts in the interest of the voters, but you also say these decisions are not made by the leader, they're made by the ruling classes. You've run this country for so long, you've known all these American presidents. What are those power centers in the United States, do you think? Like, who actually makes the decisions?
Я не знаю. Это Америка сложная страна, такая очень, с одной стороны, консервативная.
I don't know. America is a complex country, conservative on one hand, rapidly changing on the other. It's not easy for us to sort it all out. Who makes decisions in the elections? Is it possible to understand this when each state has its own legislation? Each state regulates itself? Someone can be excluded from elections at the state level. It is a two-stage electoral system. It is very difficult for us to understand it. Certainly, there are two parties that are dominant, the Republicans and the Democrats. And within this party system, the centers that make decisions, that prepare decisions. Then, look, why, in my opinion, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, such an erroneous, crude, completely unjustified policy of pressure was pursued against Russia? After all, this is a policy of pressure. NATO expansion, support for the separatists in Caucasus, creation of a missile defense system. These are all elements of pressure. Pressure, pressure, pressure. Then, dragging Ukraine into NATO is all about pressure, pressure, pressure. Why? I think, among other things, because excessive production capacities were created. During the confrontation with the Soviet Union, there were many centers created and specialists on the Soviet Union who could not do anything else. They convinced the political leadership that it is necessary to continue chiseling Russia, to try to break it up, to create on this territory several quasi-state entities, and to subdue them in a divided form, to use their combined potential for the future struggle with China. This is a mistake, including the excessive potential of those who worked for the confrontation with the Soviet Union. It is necessary to get rid of this. There should be new, fresh forces, people who look into the future and understand what is happening in the world. Look at how Indonesia is developing. 600 million people. Where can we get away from that? Nowhere. We just have to assume that Indonesia will enter.
Indonesia
It is
has
already
nowhere
in the club
close
of the
to
world.
600 million people in population.
Dude, just out of curiosity, do you know what the actual ballpark is?
It'll be like 260
Okay.
million. Fact check me and tell me how far off I am.
World's leading economies, no matter who likes it or dislikes it. Yes, we understand and are aware that in the United States, despite all the economic problems,
273.8 million, apparently.
I said 260.
Yep.
I'm pleased with that.
the situation is still normal, with the economy growing decently. The GDP is growing by 2.5%, if I'm not mistaken. But if we want to ensure the future, then we need to change our approach to what is changing. As I already said, the world would nevertheless change, regardless of how the developments in Ukraine end. The world is changing. In the United States themselves, experts are writing that the United States are nonetheless gradually changing their position in the world. It is your experts who write that. I just read them. The only question is how this would happen, painfully and quickly, or gently and gradually. And this is written by people who are not anti-American. They simply follow global development trends. That's it. And in order to assess them and change policies, we need people who think, look forward, can analyze and recommend certain decisions at the level of political leaders.
I just have to ask, you've said clearly that NATO expansion eastward is a violation of the promise you all were made in 1990. It's a threat to your country. Right before you sent troops into Ukraine, the Vice President of the United States went to the Munich Security Conference and encouraged the President of Ukraine to join NATO. Do you think that was an effort to provoke you into military action?
Мы просто, я еще раз повторяю, мы многократно предлагали
I
искать
repeat once again, we have repeatedly proposed to seek a solution to the problems that arose in Ukraine after 2014 coup d'etat through peaceful means. But no one listened to us. And moreover, the Ukrainian leaders who were under the complete US control suddenly declared that they would not comply with the Minsk agreements. They disliked everything there and continued military activity in that territory.
шло освоение этой территории натовскими военными структурами под видом различных центров.
And in parallel, that territory was being exploited by NATO military structures under the guise of various personnel training and retraining centers. They essentially began to create bases there. That's all. Ukraine announced that the Russians were a non-titular nationality, while passing the laws that limit the rights of non-titular nationalities in Ukraine. Ukraine, having received all these southeastern territories as a gift from the Russian people, suddenly announced that the Russians were a non-titular nationality in that territory. Is that normal? All this put together led to the decision to end the war that neo-Nazis started in Ukraine in 2014.
Do you think Zelensky has the freedom to negotiate a settlement to this conflict?
I don't know the details. Of course, it's difficult for me to judge. But I believe he has, in any case, he used to have. His father fought against the fascists, Nazis, during World War II. I once talked to him about this. I said, Volodya, what are you doing? Why are you supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine today, while your father fought against fascism? He was a frontline soldier. I will not tell you what he answered. This is a separate topic, and I think it's incorrect for me to do so. But as to the freedom of choice, why not? He came to power on the expectations of Ukrainian people that he would lead Ukraine to peace. He talked about this. It was thanks to this that he won the elections overwhelmingly. But then, when he came to power, in my opinion, he realized two things. Firstly, it is better not to clash with neo-Nazis and nationalists because they are aggressive and very active. You can expect anything from them. And secondly, the US-led West supports them and will always support those who antagonize with Russia. It is beneficial and safe. So he took the relevant position despite promising his people to end the war in Ukraine. He deceived his voters.
But do you think at this point, as of February
One thing I appreciate
2024, he has the
about
latitude?
what Putin just said is that he's not a hypocrite. He said, Zelensky, of course, he coddled his far right and he refused to go against the Nazis in his own country. And in this case, Putin is just leading by example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. This is yes, this is how it's done. Yes, this it's what you have to do when you come to power and you see you see who you have to make deals with or who it's in your interest to make deals with.
Frankly, if he didn't invite that Nazi, I would have lost respect for him.
Right.
To speak with you or your government directly about putting an end to this, which clearly isn't helping his country or the world. Can he do that, do you think?
Ну, а почему нет? Он же
Why
считается
not?
главой государства.
He considers
президентом
himself
Хотя
head of
мы
state.
считаем в
He
России,
won
что
the
все, что
elections.
произошло после 2014
Although we
года,
believe in Russia that the coup d'etat
первичным
is the
источником
primary
власти
source of
является
power
местный
for
народ.
everything
И в
that
этом смысле
happened
даже
after
сегодняшняя власть
2014.
является ущербной.
And in this
Но
sense,
он
even
считает
today,
себя
government
президентом
is flawed.
в этом качестве его
But
признали
he considers
все
himself
Соединенные
the
Штаты,
president,
вся
and
Европа,
he is recognized by the United States,
почему нет?
all of Europe, and
Может, мы же
practically the rest of the
переделали
world in such a capacity.
Стамбул.
Why not? He
Договорились,
can.
он же знал об этом. Более
We
того,
negotiated with
руководитель
Ukraine in
переговорной
Istanbul.
группы
We agreed.
Арахамия,
He
по-моему,
was aware of
он,
this.
до сих пор
Moreover,
возглавляет,
the
фракцию,
negotiation group leader, Mr.
правящей
Arahamia
партии,
is his
правильно,
last name,
правящей партии,
I believe still
партии
heads the
президента
faction of the ruling
в
party,
Раде. Он же
the
возглавляет
party
до
of the
сих пор
president in the Rada.
президента в Раде,
He
в
still heads the
парламенте.
presidential faction in the Rada, the
Он даже
country's
поставил свою
parliament.
подпись
He still
предварительно
sits there.
на этом документе.
He even put his preliminary
Потом
signature
он
on the
же
document
публично
I am
на весь
telling
мир
you about.
заявил: мы были
But then
готовы
he
подписать
publicly
этот документ,
stated
но
to the
приехал
whole
господин
world,
Джонсон,
we were ready to
когда
sign this
премьер-министр
document, but
Великобритании,
Mr.
отговорил
Johnson,
нас об
then
этом
the
и
Prime Minister
сказал,
of
что
Great
лучше
Britain,
воевать с Россией.
came and
Они нам все
dissuaded us
дадут
from
для
doing
того,
this,
чтобы
saying
мы
it was
вернули
better to fight
утраченное
Russia. They would give everything needed for us to return what was
И
lost
мы,
during the clashes
сказал,
with Russia,
согласились с этим
and we
предложением. Вот
agreed with
смотрите,
this
что
proposal. Look,
опубликовано.
his
Он
statement
заявил, он
has been
сказал это
published. He
публично.
said it publicly.
Могут они к
Can
этому
they
вернуться?
return
Нет.
to this
То
or
есть
not?
вопрос,
The
хотят они или
question
нет.
is, do they
А
want
после
it or
этого
not?
еще господин президент
Further
Украины
on, President of Ukraine
издал
issued a decree
декрет,
prohibiting
запрещающий
negotiations with
переговоры.
us.
Ну пусть он отменит
Let
этот
him
декрет.
cancel that
Мы же не
decree,
отказывались от
and
переговоров.
that's it.
Вот нам все
We have
время
never
говорят,
refused
готова Россия,
negotiations,
готова. Да
indeed.
мы не отказывались.
We hear all the
Они же
time, is
публично,
Russia ready?
публично отказались.
Yes,
Ну
we
что
have
ж,
not refused. It
пускай
was them
отменит
who
свой
publicly
декрет и
refused.
вступает в переговоры.
Well, let him cancel his
А то,
decree
что они
and enter into
подчинились требованию
negotiations.
либо
We
уговорам
have never
бывшего
refused.
премьер-министра Великобритании господина Джонсона,
And the fact
ну,
that
мне
they
кажется, что
obeyed the demand or
нелепо и
persuasion of Mr. Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain,
печально, потому что,
seems ridiculous
как
and
сказал
very sad to
господин
me,
Арахамия, мы еще
because,
полтора
as
года назад
Mr.
могли
Arakamia put it,
прекратить эти
we could have stopped those hostilities with
Но
war
раз
a year and a half ago
уговорили,
already.
и мы от этого отказались.
But the British
Нет
persuaded us
господин
and we
Джонсон,
refused
а
this.
война продолжается.
Where is Mr. Johnson now? And the war continues.
That's a good question. Where do you think he is, and why did he do that?
Да хрен его знает, зачем я не понимаю. Общая
Hell
установка была.
knows.
Почему-то
I
всем
don't
сложилось
understand it
иллюзия,
myself.
что Россию можно победить на поле.
There was a general starting point. For some
Основание
reason, everyone had the illusion that Russia could be
большому
defeated on the battlefield.
от чистого сердца, но
Because of arrogance, because of a pure heart, but not because of a great mind.
You've described the connection between Russia and Ukraine. You've described Russia itself a couple of times as orthodox. That's central to your understanding of Russia. You've said you're orthodox. What does that mean for you? You're a Christian leader by your own description. So what effect does that have on you?
You know,
знаете, вот
as I already mentioned, in
как я уже сказал,
988,
в 985
Prince
году
Vladimir himself was
Владимир
baptized,
крестил.
following the
Сам
example of
крестился
his
по примеру
grandmother,
своей
Princess
бабушки Марии
Olga.
Ольги.
And then he
Потом
baptized his
крестил
squad.
свою дружину,
And
потом
then,
постепенно
gradually,
через
over the
лет
course of
крестил
several
всего
years,
Бога.
he baptized all the Rus.
Язычница от
It was a
язычников к
lengthy
христианам.
process, from
Много.
pagans to
Но
Christians.
в
It
конечном
took many
итоге вот
years.
это православие
But in
восточное
the end,
христианство,
this
оно
orthodoxy,
глубоко
Eastern Christianity, deeply rooted itself in the consciousness of the Russian people.
Когда Россия расширялась,
When Russia expanded and
себя
absorbed other
другие
nations
народы,
who profess
и
Islam,
те, кто
Buddhism,
ислам,
and
буддизм,
Judaism,
иудаизм,
Russia has always been very
Россия
loyal to
всегда
those people who
относилась
profess
очень
other
лояльно
religions. This is her
к
strength.
тем людям,
This
которые
is
исповедуют
absolutely
другие религии.
clear.
В этом
And
This
the
is a
fact
lie.
is that the main postulates, main
Yeah, you know, I have to say, I'll just for a sentence or two, I will do my version of you on Monday and say that I think that my ancestors in the Pale of Settlement would like a word about that.
It's even in terms of, and he really reaches for everybody. He really, Buddhists, Muslims, but even within
I mean,
Russian
Jews is particularly
Orthodoxy.
good, like a
Oh,
group
yeah.
of people who, Russia was historically very nice to, like, famously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Famously nice to the that Russian hospitality. But yeah, even dissenting groups of Orthodox believers, like literally they're called the Old Believers, suffered great intense repression. There were periods of time when you couldn't import books into the Russian Empire, right? This idea of naturally harmonious coexistence is simply a lie. I mean, there were periods when inter-ethnic, interfaith relations were better, and times when they were worse. But presenting Imperial Russia as this kind of multicultural paradise is just a lie.
Yeah. I mean, this look, the Soviet Union, I think it would be fair to say, had room for improvement on this. But yes, saying that.
I mean, the Soviets had the decency to be hypocrites, right?
Exactly. They at least had proclaimed ideals from which it would follow that they wouldn't act that way. And, and there are different periods of Soviet history in which they were worse and much worse at like following through on them. But yes, there was at least, like, parts of that where, it was a big improvement or whatever. It's complicated, but yes, try to bring in, like, Imperial Tsarist Russia as an example of, multicultural tolerance really is a bit much. I also think that it's telling that Tucker, again, you can kind of see throughout this interview, Tucker seeing points where he brings in his own fixations and tries to get Putin to co-sign them. And so, the one that's come up the most, of course, is China. And, since that's, as you said in the chat, that's Tucker's big villain, and he wants Putin to hate them with him. And of course, Putin's not going to do that. That's his ally. You also saw that when I don't think Tucker said Trump's name, but it was obvious what he meant, right? He was like, oh, well, if somebody else came in and replaced Biden, then maybe, you could get along okay with the United States. And Putin didn't really take that one either. He was like, it's a much bigger problem than personality of leader, And now Tucker is trying to get Putin to talk about his Christian faith. And Putin's response was, oh, you want to know about Russian Orthodoxy? Okay, in 988. Like, there's no he's just not gonna do that. He's not gonna play that game. Like, he isn't. I mean, a little bit of this might reflect some some cultural differences that in terms of people's level of comfort, going on about their personal relationship to God or whatever. I remember I have a friend who is married to a Romanian Orthodox woman, and I remember him telling me once that part of the difference between Eastern Orthodoxy and Christianity, as it's typically expressed in the West, has to do with people being a little bit less fixated on what's going on in your particular head. That this just isn't the sort of focus of everything in the same way. But also, frankly, I think that it's Putin heads a very socially conservative government, gay propaganda law, etc. He certainly benefits from a political alliance with Russian Orthodox hierarchy. But I just don't know how much he's personally interested in pretending to have deep reservoirs of personal spirituality.
Yeah, I think that that's the one thing that Putin might unironically, sincerely venerate is the trans-historical Russian state, right? He seems to be serious about that. But the idea that he's going to take on pick up the cross, right, and become neo-patriarch of some kind of pan-Christian reaction, that cuts against not just what we know of Putin, but contemporary Russia is not the Russian Empire. The religiosity of the Russian people is nowhere near as great as that of the United States, for instance. And it would be really freaking weird for his Russian audience to hear him talking about Jesus this and Jesus that.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, and I feel like he might just be, I feel like like Tucker might just be misunderstanding some of what Putin's point was in the sort of context in which he was bringing up, Orthodox Christianity earlier, because he was sort of bringing it up in the same breath as talking about like people speaking Russian and all of that stuff. It's a national identity marker, it's like the classic, cheesy joke about the troubles in Northern Ireland, the guy at the, who, jumps you in the back alley and, and asks if you're a Catholic or Protestant. You say an atheist, and like, yeah, but a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist, right? Like, because that's, they're not asking you about your, they're not asking you about your personal relationship to Jesus.
Pick a team.
Main values are very similar, not to say the same, in all world religions I've just mentioned, and which are the traditional religions of the Russian Federation, Russia. By the way, Russian authorities were always very careful about the culture and religion of those people who came into the Russian Empire. This, in my opinion, forms the basis of both security and stability of the Russian statehood. All the peoples inhabiting Russia basically consider it their motherhood. If, say, people move over to you or to Europe from Latin America, an even clearer and more understandable example, people come, but yet they have come to you or to European countries from their historical homeland. And people who profess different religions in Russia consider Russia their motherland. They have no other motherland. We are together. This is one big family, and our traditional values are very similar. I've just mentioned one big family, but everyone has her own family. And this is the basis of our society. And if we say that the motherland and the family are specifically connected with each other, it is indeed the case, since it is impossible to ensure a normal future for our children and our families unless we ensure a normal, sustainable future for the entire country, for the motherland. That is why patriotic sentiment is so strong in Russia.
But can I say that the one way in which the religions are different is that Christianity is specifically a nonviolent religion. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, don't kill. How can a leader who has to kill, of any country, how can a leader be a Christian? How do you reconcile that to yourself?
I think this part, Putin, like us, has the exact same thought, which is going to be just like skip ahead to when it gets interesting again. I didn't realize this was Sunday school or freshman ethics tutorial.
Yeah, I think that Tucker just really wants. I think Tucker just really wants Putin to say something about how intense his Christian faith is, because that's what's going to sell Putin to Tucker's audience. And Putin, it just has the reaction that you said. Is like, this is weird, and it like, why are you wasting time in my interview with this?
It's very easy when it comes to protecting oneself and one's family, one's homeland. We won't attack anyone. When did the developments in Ukraine start?
на Донбассе. Вот с чего. И мы
Since the coup
защищаем
d'etat and the
свою
hostilities in
землю,
Donbass
свою
began,
и наше
that's when they started.
Что
And we're
касается
protecting our people,
религии в целом,
ourselves, our
она,
homeland, and our
знаете, ведь
future.
она не во внешних проявлениях, не в том, чтобы ходить
As for religion in
в церковь
general,
или бить головой в пол. Она в сердце.
you know, it's not about external manifestations.
И
It's not about going to
мы
church every day
у
or
нас культура
banging
такая,
your head on the floor.
человекоориентированная. И
It
Достоевский,
is in
который
the
очень
heart.
известен
And our culture is so human oriented.
гений,
Dostoevsky, who was
мудрый русский
very
литератор,
well known in the West and the
много об
genius
этом
of
говорил о
Russian
русской
culture,
душе.
Russian literature,
Вот все-таки Запад
spoke a lot
он более
about this,
прагматичен.
about the Russian soul.
Русский человек, российский человек, он думает больше о вечном, он думает больше о ценности,
After all,
моральных,
Western society is more pragmatic.
Не знаю,
Russian
может, вы
people
со мной
think
согласитесь,
more
но
about the
всё-таки
eternal,
западная
about
культура,
moral
она всё-таки
values.
более прагматична.
I don't know, maybe you
И
won't agree with
это,
me,
в
but
принципе,
Western
я не говорю, что
culture
это
is
плохо.
more pragmatic
Это
after
дает
all.
возможность вот сегодняшнему этому золотому миллиарду
I'm
добиваться
not
хорошего
saying this is
успеха
bad. It makes it
в производстве,
possible for today's golden
хороших
billion to
науке.
achieve good success
Здесь
in
нет ничего
production,
плохого. Я
even in
просто
science and so
I'm
on.
shocked that
это
Jordan Peterson didn't
выглядит
pop
модерн.
out from backstage when he said Dostoevsky.
Yeah, that's you get very excited about this. Jordan Peterson's also I remember, God, way back in 2022, watching some Dr. Peterson content where he seemed to be he seemed to be pretty fond of Putin also, which is I think in that same sort of way that like I think a lot of this is kind of pandering to that Putin Putin seems very based, he's not gonna not gonna be able to get him to say his pronouns.
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that we kind of look the same, but our
Well,
minds
so
are
do you
built a
see
little
the
different.
supernatural at work as you look out across what's happening in the world now? Do you see God at work? Do you ever think to yourself, these are forces that are not human?
Да нет, я, честно говоря, так не думаю. Я думаю о том, что
No, to be honest, I don't
мировое
think
сообщество
so.
развивается вот по своим внутренним.
Yeah, it's just I actually mentioned this on Monday, but this may be my favorite exchange of the interview. That that like one last attempt, like it just like so. Do you see God at work in all this? What? No, right? I look, man. You asked me about Russian Orthodox Christianity, so I told you about 988. That didn't make you happy, so I told you about Dostoevsky. But there's a limit here. I'm just, I'm just not gonna. I'm just, I'm. It's just not a requirement of a Russian leader that that they play this particular game, and he's just not going to play it. Oh, you're muted, Kuba.
The one consistent aspect of Russian foreign policy across the Soviet and post-Soviet period is that their leadership is not crazy. They are ruthless. They are devious, not particularly trustworthy, but that there's a rational calculus there and not some kind of millenarian apocalyptic fever. And Tucker Carlson is basically asking him to throw all that away. Right.
Yeah, right. I mean, which is actually, look, this is like the best thing about Putin, that he's not gonna do his equivalent of George W. Bush saying that God instructed him to attack Saddam Hussein.
My opinion is that the development of the world community is in accordance with the inherent laws, and those laws are what they are. It's always been this way in the history of mankind. Some nations and countries rose, became stronger and more numerous, and then left the international stage, losing the status they had accustomed to. There's probably no need for me to give examples, but we could start with the Genghis Khan and horde conquerors, the Golden Horde, and then end with the Roman Empire. It seems that there has never been anything like the Roman Empire in the history of mankind. Nevertheless, the potential of the barbarians gradually grew, as did their population. In general, the barbarians were getting stronger and begun to develop economically, as we would say today. This eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the regime imposed by the Romans. However, it took 5 centuries for the Roman Empire to fall apart. The difference with what is happening now is that all the processes of change are happening at a much faster pace than in Roman times.
So when does the AI empire start, do you think?
You're asking increasingly more complicated questions. To answer them, you need to be an expert in big numbers, big data, and AI. Mankind is currently facing many threats. Due to the genetic researches, it is now possible to create a superhuman, a specialized human being, a genetically engineered athlete, scientist, military man. There are reports that Elon Musk had already had a chip implanted in the human brain in the USA.
What do you think of that?
Well, I think there's no stopping Elon Musk. He will do as he sees fit. Nevertheless, you need to find some common ground with him, search for ways to persuade him. I think he's a smart person, I truly believe he is. So you need to reach an agreement with him because this process needs to be formalized and subjected to certain rules. Humanity has to consider what is going to happen due to the newest development in genetics or in AI. One can make an approximate prediction of what will happen. Once mankind felt an existential threat coming from nuclear weapons, all nuclear nations began to come to terms with one another since they realized the negligent use of nuclear weaponry could drive humanity to extinction. It is impossible to stop research in genetics or AI today, just as it was impossible to stop the use of gunpowder back in the day. But as soon as we realize that the threat comes from unbridled and uncontrolled development of AI, or genetics, or any other field, the time will come to reach an international agreement on how to regulate these things.
I appreciate all the time you've given us. I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evan Gershkovich, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter. He's 32, and he's been in prison for almost a year. This is a huge story in the United States, and I just want to ask you directly, without getting into the details of it or your version of what happened, if as a sign of your decency, you would be willing to release him to us and we'll bring him back to the United States.
Мы столько сделали жестов доброй воли, что, мне кажется, мы исчерпали все лимиты.
We have done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we have run out of them.
Ни разу не ответил.
We have never seen anyone reciprocate to us in a similar manner. However, in theory, we can say that we do not rule out that we can do that if our partners take reciprocal steps. When I talk about the partners, I first of all refer to special services. Special services are in contact with one another. They are talking about the matter in question.
на то, чтобы не решить эту
There is no
проблему.
taboo to settle this
Мы
issue.
готовы ее решать.
We are
Но
willing to solve
там
it.
есть определенные условия, которые
But there are certain terms being discussed via special services
по
channels.
партнерским каналам между спецслужбами. Мы
I believe an
достаточно
agreement can be reached.
So typically, I mean, this stuff has happened for obviously centuries. One country catches another spy within its borders, it trades it for one of its own intel guys in another country. I think what makes, and it's not my business, but what makes this different is the guy's obviously not a spy, he's a kid. And maybe he was breaking your law in some way, but he's not a super spy, and everybody knows that. And he's being held hostage in exchange, which is true. With respect, it's true, and everyone knows it's true. So maybe he's in a different category. Maybe it's not fair to ask for, you know, somebody else in exchange for letting him out. Maybe it degrades Russia to do that.
Вы знаете, ну, можно как угодно говорить, что такое шпион, что не
You
шпион.
know,
Но
you
есть
can give
определенные
different
вещи,
interpretations to what
например,
constitutes a
если
spy,
человек получает секретную
but there are
информацию,
certain things provided by law. If person gets
на
secret
конспиративной
information
основе,
and does that in conspiratorial manner, then this is qualified as espionage. And that is exactly what he was doing. He was receiving classified, confidential information, and he did it covertly. Maybe he did that out of carelessness or his own initiative. Considering the sheer fact, this is qualified as espionage. The fact has been proven, as he was caught red-handed when he was receiving this information. If it had been some far-fetched excuse, some fabrication, something not proven, it would have been a different story then. But he was caught red-handed when he was secretly getting confidential information. What is it then?
But are you suggesting that he was working for the US government or NATO, or he was just a reporter who was given material he wasn't supposed to have? Those seem like very different things.
Я не знаю, на кого он работал. Но повторяю еще раз.
I don't know who
получение
he was
секретной
working for,
информации на конспиративной
but
основе
I would
это
like to
шпионаж.
reiterate that
Там
getting
работал
classified
американских
information
спецслужб,
in
каких-то
secret
других структур.
is called
Я не думаю, что он
espionage,
работал на
and
Монако.
he was working for the US Special Services, some other agencies.
Вот, ну,
I don't think he was working for Monaco, as Monaco is hardly interested in getting that information.
есть
It is up to
люди,
special services to come to an
тоже,
agreement.
по нашему мнению, не связаны
Some groundwork has been laid. There are people who, in our view, are not connected with special services.
Соединенных Штатов,
Let me tell you a story about a person serving a sentence in an allied
который
country
из
of the
патриотических
US.
соображений ликвидировал в
That
одной из
person, due
европейских
to
столиц
patriotic sentiments, eliminated a bandit in one of the European capitals.
во время событий на Кавказе. Знаете, что
During the events in the Caucasus, do you know what he was
не
doing?
хочется говорить, но тем не менее скажу.
I don't want
Он
to say
выкупил
that,
наших
but
солдат
I will do it anyway.
на
He was laying our soldiers, taken prisoner, on the road and then drove his car over their heads. What kind of person is that?
человек. И человек
Can he even be called human?
нашелся патриот, который ликвидировал его в одной из европейских стран.
But there was a patriot who eliminated him in one of the
Сделал
European
по собственной
capitals.
инициативе или нет,
Whether he did it of his own volition or not, that is a different question.
Yeah, but Evan
Вот он-
Gershkovich didn't
вот
do
он
that. I mean, that's a completely different. I mean, this is a
Да, он не-
32-year-old like
ну, он
newspaper
делал, да, он-
reporter.
He committed
делал
something
другое.
different.
Да, он не просто журналист. Я повторяю еще раз, это журналист.
He's
который
not
получил
just a
секретную
journalist.
информацию на
I
конспиративной
reiterate, he's a journalist who was
да, это
secretly
другая история
getting
здесь. Я
confidential
просто говорю про
information.
тех людей, которые
Yes, it is different, but still, I'm
по сути,
talking
под
about
контролем
other people who are
властей,
essentially
где бы они ни
controlled by
сидели.
the US authorities, wherever they are
И
serving a
между
sentence.
спецслужбами идет диалог.
There is an ongoing dialogue between the
Это должно
special
решаться
services.
спокойно.
This has to be resolved in a calm, responsible, and professional manner. They are keeping in touch, so let them do their work.
Тот человек, о котором вы сказали, господин
I do not rule out that the person you refer to, Mr. Gershkovich, may return to his motherland. By the end of the day, it does not make any sense to keep him in prison in Russia. We want the US Special Services to think about how they can contribute to achieving the goals our special services are pursuing.
те проблемы,
We are ready
I'm
to talk.
surprised that
Moreover,
Putin isn't using
dogs
this
are-
opportunity to rub in the fact that Tucker didn't qualify for the CIA.
Oh, what if the difference?
You know, I would be talking to you if you had not failed at intelligence career.
Yes, then we could. Then you and I could talk about such things. Yeah, yeah.
But instead, you come here with God this, God that.
It is genuinely wild that Tucker thought that he could throw in like a prisoner release. That's just something he could get at the end of this interview.
Yeah, exactly. I like this because Tucker is adding a hostage negotiator to the list of careers he's failed at.
It's just like yeah. I mean, more power to him, I guess. But it's just like it's just really amazing that he thinks that this is how it would work. That it's like. That his translator passed by. It's like, oh yeah, no problem. It's hey, Yuri, let American man out of prison. My new friend Tucker just asked me to.
Round out the boy and give them a ride to airport. Ask them if they want caviar and girls.
Are underway. And there have been many successful examples of these talks crowned with success. Probably this is going to be crowned with success as well. But we have to come to an agreement.
I hope you let him out. Mr. President, thank you.
I also want him to return to his homeland at last. I'm absolutely sincere. But let me say once again, the dialogue continues. The more public we render things of this nature, the more difficult it becomes to resolve them. Everything has to be done in calm manner.
I wonder if that's true with the war, though. Also, I mean, I want to ask one more question, which is, and maybe you don't want to say so for strategic reasons, but are you worried that what's happening in Ukraine could lead to something much larger and much more horrible? And how motivated are you just to call the US government and say, let's come to terms?
I already said that we did not refuse to talk. We're willing to negotiate. It is the Western side, and Ukraine is obviously a satellite state of the US. It is evident. I do not want you to take it as if I'm looking for a strong word or an insult, but we both understand what is happening. The financial support, 72 billion US dollars, was provided. Germany ranks second, then other European countries come. Dozens of billions of US dollars are going to Ukraine. There's a huge influx of weapons. In this case, you should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and come to a negotiating table, rescind this absurd decree. We did not refuse.
Sure, but you already said it. I didn't think you meant it as an insult because you already said correctly, it's been reported that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister acting on behalf of the Biden administration. So of course they're a satellite. Big countries control small countries. That's not new. And that's why I asked about dealing directly with the Biden administration, which is making these decisions, not President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Если администрация Зеленского на Украине отказалась от переговоров,
well, if the Zelensky administration in Ukraine refused to negotiate, I assume they did it under the instruction from Washington. If Washington believes it to be the wrong decision, let it abandon it. Let it find a delicate excuse so that no one is insulted. Let it come up with a way out. It was not us who made this decision, it was them. So let them go back on it. That is it. However, they made the wrong decision, and now we have to look for a way out of the situation to correct their mistakes.
исправлять.
They did it, so let them correct it themselves. We support this.
So I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying. I don't think that I am. I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Правильно. Но мы
Right.
уже добились этого.
And
Мы
we made it.
создали
We
ком-
prepared the
большой
huge document
документ,
in Istanbul that was
Istanbul,
initialed by the head of the
который
Ukrainian
был
delegation.
парафирован
He affixed his
руководителем
signature to
украинской
some of the
делегации.
provisions,
Там
not to
подпись
all of
его
it.
стоит.
He put
Ну,
his signature, and
вы
then
вышли
he
на
himself
договор,
said,
всё, а
"We
написано,
were
там
ready to
подпись
sign
ваша
it, and the
стоит.
war would
А
have been
потом он же
over long
сказал,
ago,
мы были готовы
18 months
подписать,
ago."
и война бы уже давно
However,
закончилась.
Prime Minister Johnson came,
приехал
talked us out of it,
Джонсон,
and we missed that
отговорил нас
chance.
от этого. И
Well,
мы
you missed
упустили
it,
этот
you
шанс.
made a
Мы
mistake.
упустили,
Let them
совершили
get
ошибку.
back to
Пусть
that,
вернутся к
that
этому.
is all.
Вот и
Why do
всё.
we have to bother ourselves and
пожалуйста,
correct
не
somebody else's mistakes? I know one can say it is our mistake.
Понимаю, может
It
сказать,
was
что
us who
наша ошибка,
intensified the
что
situation
мы
and decided to put an
интенсифицировали
end to the
действия с
war
помощью
that
оружия,
started
решили
in
поплатить эту войну,
2014 in
как я сказал,
Donbass,
начатую
as I have already
2014
said, by
годом
means of
на
weapons. Let me get back
Но я
to
скажу,
further in
что
history.
а,
I already
вы
told
уже,
you
я уже об
this.
этом говорил, мы с вами сейчас обсуждали.
We were just
Тогда
discussing it.
вернемся в 91
Let us go
год,
back to
когда я, значит,
1991, when we were promised that NATO would not expand, to 2008, when the doors to NATO opened to the declaration of state sovereignty of Ukraine, declaring Ukraine a neutral state. Let us go back to the fact that NATO and US military bases started to appear on the territory of Ukraine, creating threats to us. Let us go back to coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. It is pointless, though, isn't it? We may go back and forth endlessly, but they stop negotiations. Is it a mistake? Yes. Correct it. We are ready. What else is needed?
Do you think it's too humiliating at this point for NATO to accept Russian control of what was 2 years ago Ukrainian territory?
Я же сказал.
I said, let them think how to do it with dignity. There are options if there is a will.
Варианты есть. Но если желание.
Up until now, there has been the uproar and screaming about inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield.
Стратегического поражения России, поражения на
Now they are apparently coming to realize that it is difficult to achieve, if possible at all. In my opinion, it is impossible by definition. It is never going to happen. It seems to me that now those who are in power in the West have come to realize this as well. If so, if the realization has set in, they have to think what to do next. We are ready for this dialogue.
Would you be willing to say, congratulations, NATO, you won, and just keep the situation where it is now?
Ну, вы знаете, это предмет переговоров.
You know, it is a subject matter for the negotiations no one is willing to conduct, or to put it more accurately,
Или, точнее сказать, хотят.
they are willing but do not know how to do it.
Я не только вижу,
I know they want
я
it.
знаю.
It is not just I see it, but I know they do want it. But they're struggling to understand how to do it. They have driven the situation to the point where we are at. It is not us who have done that. It is our partners, opponents who have done that. Well, now let them think how to reverse the situation. We're not against it. It would be funny if it were not so sad.
Да, было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно.
This endless mobilization in Ukraine, the hysteria, the domestic problems, sooner or later it will result in agreement.
Истерика, там, внутренние проблемы.
You know, this probably sounds strange given the
Рано
current
или
situation,
поздно все равно мы договоримся. И
but the relations between the two peoples will be
может, даже
rebuilt
странно в
anyway.
сегодняшней ситуации прозвучит.
It will
Всё
take a lot
равно
of time, but they
отношения
will
между,
heal.
между народами восстановятся. Потребуется много времени.
I'll give you very unusual examples.
Совсем приведу вам необычный пример.
There is a combat encounter on the
На поле боя
battlefield. Here's a
происходит
specific
бой
example.
конкретно.
Ukrainian soldiers got encircled.
Конкретно.
This is an example from real life.
Украинская-
Our soldiers were
украинские
shouting to
солдаты
them,
попали в окружение.
"There is no chance, surrender yourselves, come out and you will be alive. Suddenly, the Ukrainian soldiers were screaming from there in Russian, perfect Russian, saying, Russians, do not surrender. And all of them perished. They still identify themselves as Russian. What is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of a civil war. Everyone in the West thinks that the Russian people have been split by hostilities forever. No, they will be reunited. The unity is still there. Why are the Ukrainian authorities dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because it brings together not only the territory, it brings together our souls. No one will be able to separate the soul. Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
No, I think that's great. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah. Well, I guess overall, I have to say, it seems like Tucker wanted Putin to sign off on the anti-China hawkery. He wanted him to say that, you know, that he would be better able to do a deal with Trump. He wanted him to talk about God, and he wanted him to, at the very least, you know, just give him and the crew like a hostage, just like a going away present. And none of those four things were achieved, but
Perfect
at least
record.
Yes.
Just unbroken streak.
You know, he got a high profile interview out of it, but I think the in-interview goals, you know, it just is a hat trick of failure.
Yeah, and I think that no matter what the potential propaganda upsides, I'm not certain if Putin at this point could. Let me put it this way: he's the sort of interview subject, interlocutor, negotiator, where you have to really earn any points against him.
Mm-hmm.
And Tucker did not come correct. If this looks like a B or C game, if this is the best that he can do, then he should stay home.
Yeah, fair enough. You know, it's sort of a yeah. I think the Tucker was a horrible interviewer on just about every level. Honestly, like he you know, he couldn't control the flow of the conversation, as evidenced by the fact that a good solid half an hour of it was spent on wandering around the sort of fields of distant past history. He let Putin just sort of go off forever without redirected. And I can understand, you could say, you know, it's Putin, what are you going to do? But like, then when Tucker did have a chance to to step in, you know, what did he do? I mean, he brought up a few of his pet fixations and things that he thought would exhibit Putin in a favorable light for his own audience. He asked him when the AI empire would start.
Yes, he just approached this in that fundamentally unserious way he approaches to all of his interviews with friendly figures, right? He expects them to play ball with him, that it's a pas de deux. But Putin's not going to take your hints, and he's not going to like throw you a bone for no reason. This is not the collegial and civil, right, like American Senate. This is it's a blood sport.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very strange. I think we, I think that's, we really got, and, and again, we talked about this last time, but, it is striking how, even though Tucker was so clearly ready, to provide a friendly platform, that Putin's own comments on it, since the interview, like have been like he just cannot resist the temptation to trash talk, like what a terrible interviewer Tucker was.
Yeah, I think that actually, if Trump gets reelected and there's a Putin-Trump summit, the very first thing they're going to do is compare notes about how terrible Tucker Carlson is.
Well, I hope that Trump isn't reelected, but if he is, if there is some kind of negotiated de-escalation in Ukraine, that's definitely a silver lining. And if it somehow comes out later that the talks were, that like the icebreaker at the talks was how was what an awful stupid interviewer Tucker Carlson is, that will also make me happy.
Now, frankly, I'm seeing a missed opportunity. Putin should have offered to release the hostage if Tucker Carlson was willing to take his place. Give him that offer on the air, right? Yeah, you can leave right away. Just
we can arrange it in the next hour.
I believe it is what your Christian God would want, no? Love thy neighbor, etc., etc.
Yeah, would have been beautiful. Yeah, it was a strange experience, but I'm glad that I watched it. Thank you so much, Kuba. This is so much fun.
The pleasure was mine. Take care, everyone.